The sound of a pen scratching across paper can be the loudest thing in a silent room if the wrong person is holding it. Vivian Oakes had been holding pens in rooms like this for 6 years, rooms with mahogany walls and leather chairs worth more than her monthly rent, rooms where men with soft hands and hard eyes talked about numbers, the way other people talked about the weather, casually, without weight, as though the figures didn't represent anything that bled. She was the kind of woman those men looked through rather than at, plus-sized, quiet, perpetually in sensible shoes. She wore her hair pinned back because loose hair, she'd learned early, invited comments. She carried her laptop bag on her left shoulder because the right one had been aching since last winter and she hadn't gotten around to seeing anyone about it. She was, by every visible measure, unremarkable. That was the whole point. The Carrington Club occupied the top 2 floors of a glass tower in downtown Toronto, above the financial district's usual noise, above the streetcar clatter and the lunch crowd and the smell of roasted chestnuts from the vendor on King Street. The elevator required a key card. The coat check required a reservation. The waitstaff wore black and moved like shadows, trained to be invisible, in the same way Vivienne had trained herself to be. Present enough to be useful, absent enough to be forgotten. She had been hired 3 years ago as a contract bookkeeper for Carrington's private membership accounts. Officially, she reconciled invoices, tracked membership fees, ensured the quarterly reports were clean enough to hand to an auditor without anyone's pulse rising. Unofficially, she knew better than to look too closely at the column of expenses, listed simply as discretionary, and she had learned, the way you learn to avoid a loose floorboard, exactly which name she was never supposed to let appear in the same ledger. One of those names was Donovan Quell. She had heard it before she ever saw the man. It moved through the club the way a weather system moves. You felt the pressure change before anything visible happened. Conversations paused, postures adjusted. The maitre, a man named Ferris, who had been unfailingly composed through 15 years of wealthy eccentricities, would go slightly still whenever Quell's reservation came through, not visibly frightened. Just careful, in the way a person is careful near something that has the capacity to go very wrong very fast. Vivienne had seen Donovan Quell twice before tonight. Once, from across the dining room, when she'd been delivering corrected invoices to the club manager's office and had paused at the wrong moment in the wrong hallway. He'd been seated at the corner table, always the corner table, she'd noticed, the one with the widest sightlines and the wall at his back, wearing a charcoal suit that fit him the way expensive things fit men who don't have to think about money. Dark hair, early 40s, jaw like something carved for effect. He'd been listening to the man across from him, with the kind of attention that felt less like courtesy and more like assessment. She'd moved on before he could turn his head. The second time, she had been in the coat check corridor retrieving her bag, and he had walked past close enough that she caught the smell of cedar and something cooler underneath. He hadn't looked at her. Men like Donovan Quell never looked at women like Vivian Oakes. She was part of the furniture. Tonight was different. Tonight, she had arrived 40 minutes early because the quarterly audit was due at 9 the following morning, and she'd discovered a discrepancy in the private dining receipts that made her stomach clench in a way she hadn't been able to shake since Wednesday. Not a large discrepancy. That was the problem. Large discrepancies were accidents. Small ones, precise ones, recurring across 4 consecutive months in the same $600 range. Those were decisions. She sat in the small anteroom off the main corridor, the one the staff used to collect themselves between services, with her laptop open and her reading glasses on, and a cup of tea that had gone cold. The door was propped open 3 inches, not enough to be noticed, just enough to let sound carry. She wasn't eavesdropping. She told herself that clearly, and believed it mostly. The dining room had filled steadily after 7. She tracked it by sound. the low churn of overlapping conversations, the periodic percussion of cutlery, the rare bright spike of laughter. Quell arrived at 7:45. She knew it was him because Ferris's footsteps changed, a slight quickening, a purposefulness that didn't characterize his usual movement. "Mr. Quell, your table is ready." A pause, then a voice, unhurried and low, that landed in the room the way a heavy object lands on still water. "Thank you, Ferris. Send Annika when she's available." Vivienne went back to her spreadsheet. She almost missed it. She had been cross-referencing receipts for 20 minutes when she heard it. Not words exactly, but a register shift. The dining room's ambient noise had a texture to it, the way a healthy heartbeat has a texture. And something had changed in that texture. A tone. A particular quality of quiet that wasn't the quiet of people being polite, but the quiet of people being careful. She looked up from the screen. Through the 3-inch gap in the door, she had a partial sightline to the main corridor. She could see the brass-framed mirror on the far wall, and in its reflection, she could see the entrance to the private dining alcove. She could see the woman. Her name was Tessa Ryan. Vivienne knew this because Tessa had been coming to the Carrington Club for the past 8 months as Donovan Quell's companion, and her name appeared in the guest registry in a handwriting that was emphatically not her own. She was tall, fair-haired, the kind of woman whose beauty read as a social credential. She wore red tonight, something structured and deliberate, and she had arrived, Vivienne now realized, not from the main entrance, but from the service corridor on the east side of the building. The east corridor led to the loading dock. The east corridor was also where the private club's security panel was located, the one that controlled the exterior camera feeds. Tessa wasn't heading toward the main dining room. She was standing in the corridor, half turned away, speaking in a low voice to a man Vivienne had never seen before. He was wide-shouldered, wore a dark jacket that sat oddly, and he was holding a phone toward Tessa the way you hold a phone when you're showing someone a photograph. Tessa nodded once, quick and tight, and the man pocketed the phone. Then she smoothed her dress, lifted her chin, and walked toward the dining room. Vivienne sat very still. She was good at that, at going still while her mind ran fast. It was the thing she did when a column of numbers stopped making sense, when 2 figures refused to reconcile, when the shape of a pattern started to emerge from what had looked like noise. She did it now. She let the image sit in front of her, and she looked at it plainly, without flinching. Tessa Ryan had just come in through the loading dock entrance. She had met a man with a gun-shaped silhouette under his jacket. She had looked at a photograph on his phone. She had nodded, and now she was walking toward the man who trusted her to be exactly where she said she was. Vivienne's tea was cold. Her hands were completely steady. She thought, I could be wrong. She thought, I am not wrong. She opened her desk drawer. There was a notepad inside, the narrow kind with a Carrington Club watermark at the top, and a pen, the good one, the one she'd bought herself because the club pens smudged. She wrote 5 words. She tore the sheet off cleanly along the perforation. She folded it once. Then she sat for another 45 seconds, which was the longest 45 seconds of her life, and thought about what she was about to do and what it would mean, and whether there was any version of this in which she stayed in her chair and kept reconciling her spreadsheet. There wasn't. She stood. She smoothed her cardigan. She picked up the nearest thing that looked like she had a reason to carry it, a folder of printed invoices, and she walked into the hallway. The dining room of the Carrington Club was designed to make its guests feel insulated from consequence. The ceilings were high, the lighting was warm and indirect, and the acoustics had been engineered to allow private conversation at every table without carrying to the next. Vivienne had always thought there was something almost funny about that. All this architecture devoted to keeping secrets, and then people like her moving through it unseen, hearing everything anyway. She walked steadily, not fast, not slow. She was a member of the back-of-house staff in a club, where back-of-house staff were part of the landscape. The server, moving past with a tray of champagne flutes, didn't look at her. The couple near the window didn't look at her. Nobody looked at her. The corner table was ahead. Donovan Quell was mid-conversation with the man across from him, a heavy-set individual in a grey suit who was making a point with his hands. Tessa sat to Quell's right, composed and lovely, her fingers wrapped lightly around a wineglass. She was watching the grey-suited man with polite attention. She didn't look at Vivienne. Vivienne didn't look at her. She approached the table from Quell's left, the side away from Tessa, with the folder held in front of her like a reasonable woman doing a reasonable thing. She set the folder down at the edge of the table as though she were delivering a corrected bill, smooth and practiced. With her right hand, steady as anything, she slid the folded note from inside the folder and placed it directly under Quell's left hand, which was resting open on the tablecloth. His fingers closed around it without any visible change in his expression. He didn't look at it. He didn't look at her. He was still listening to the grey-suited man. Vivienne picked up the folder. She walked back the way she came. She made it to the anteroom. She sat down in her chair. She put her hands flat on the desk and looked at them until they stopped trembling. The note said, "She came in through the loading dock. There's a man outside. Be careful." She didn't know if it was enough. She didn't know if it was anything. She knew that the man's jacket had sat wrong at the shoulder, and that Tessa Rianne had nodded at a photograph, and that Donovan Quell, whatever he was currently sitting in a room with his back to a woman who had just confirmed something to someone outside. Vivienne knew what ledgers looked like when someone was cooking them slowly enough to not get caught. She knew what it looked like when a pattern was disguised as noise. She had been reading between lines her entire professional life, and this was not ambiguous. She opened her laptop. She stared at the spreadsheet. She did not process a single number. 12 minutes passed. The dining room remained audibly normal. Then Ferris appeared in the corridor outside the anteroom and looked at her with an expression she had never seen on him before, which was to say, an expression at all. "Miss Oakes," he said. "Mr. Quell would like a word." Her stomach dropped exactly 6 floors. "Of course," she said. She followed him back through the corridor and into the private room adjacent to the dining area, the one used for small business gatherings and occasional tastings. It smelled of leather and old wood and the faint ghost of cigars that the no-smoking policy had never entirely eliminated. Donovan Quell was standing near the window. He had his jacket on still. His hands were in his pockets. He turned when she came in, and she made herself walk steadily the last few steps and stop at a reasonable distance. And she met his eyes. Because that was the thing she had decided on her way down the corridor. She was going to look at him directly, because looking away from men like him was a signal of a type she couldn't afford to send. His eyes were dark, a brown so deep it read almost black in low light. He studied her the way she had seen him study the man across the dinner table fully, without performance. "You work in accounting," he said. It wasn't a question. "Bookkeeping," she said. "Contract. For the membership accounts." He nodded once. "How long?" 3 years. A pause. "You wrote the note?" "Yes. Tell me what you saw," she told him. She described it precisely. The timing of Tessa's entry, the east corridor, the man with the wrong-fitting jacket, the phone, the nod, the duration. She didn't editorialize. She didn't tell him what to think about it. She laid it out the way she laid out a discrepancy in a ledger. "Here is what I observed. Here is the sequence. Here is why it does not reconcile." He listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "You work here 3 years," he said. "You've seen me." "Twice," she said. "From a distance. You know who I am." It wasn't quite a question, but it required an answer. "I know enough," she said. "And you still walked over to that table." She looked at him steadily. "I walk around numbers that don't add up," she said. "I've been doing it for 6 years. What I saw tonight didn't add up." Something shifted in his expression. Not softness, that wasn't the right word for anything about this man, but a quality of attention that had changed, the way a room changes when a door opens and the air pressure equalizes. "Stay here," he said. He left the room. She stayed. She stood in the middle of the leather and wood room and looked at her own reflection in the dark glass of the window and thought about the life she had been living. The careful, contained, make yourself small life, the one she'd constructed deliberately after years of learning that the safest version of herself was the one nobody looked at twice. That version of herself had, tonight, walked up to the most dangerous man in Toronto and slipped a folded note under his hand. She wasn't sure what that meant about the life she'd been living. She wasn't sure it was safe to think about it right now. Donovan Quell came back 23 minutes later. He did not tell her what had happened in those 23 minutes. He never did tell her directly. She learned it later, in pieces, the way she learned most things, by listening when people forgot she was there. The man outside had been positioned at the east exit. There had been a second man on the roof of the building across King Street. Tessa Rian had confirmed, via the photograph on the phone, that Quell was in the building and in his usual seat. There would have been a third man inside, someone working a shift they shouldn't have been working. None of those things had happened. Or rather, they had happened, but they had been interrupted. Quell came back into the room and stood near the door and looked at her for a moment that stretched. "You're going to want to stay off the street tonight," he said. "I'll have someone drive you home." "I have my car," she said. "You can get your car tomorrow." She looked at him. He looked at her. Something in her knew that this was not a debate. "All right," she said. She went home in the back seat of an unremarkable black car driven by a man who introduced himself only as Len and who said exactly nothing for the entire 40-minute drive to her apartment in the annex. She watched the lights of the city slide past the window, and she thought about Tessa Rian, about what would make a woman in a red dress walk through a loading dock to nod at a photograph. She thought she probably already knew the answer to that. Most betrayals didn't come from nowhere. Most of them had a weight to them, something the person had been carrying for long enough that the relief of setting it down, even badly, even disastrously, became its own kind of logic. She didn't excuse it. She just recognized it. Her apartment was on the third floor of a building that smelled like the coffee from the cafe below and like the old wood of the staircase. She let herself in and put the kettle on and stood in the kitchen in her coat for a long time. Then she took her coat off and made the tea and brought it to the couch and sat. She thought, what happens now? It wasn't a question she could answer, so she drank her tea, and eventually she slept. She went back to the Carrington Club the next morning to collect her car and to finish the audit that was, in fact, due at 9. She finished it. She emailed it. She was packing her laptop bag in the anteroom when Ferris appeared again in the doorway. "Mr. Quell has asked whether you'd be willing to meet with him this afternoon," he said. "At his office. You're not required to go." He paused, with what she recognized as considerable delicacy for a man of his professional habits. "He said to tell you that, specifically, that you're not required." Vivienne thought about this. "What time?" she said. His office was in a building near the waterfront that looked like it belonged to a mid-sized import company, which was, in fact, part of what it belonged to. The lobby was marble and modest. The elevator was fast. The floor she was brought to had a view of the lake that was startling in its openness, the whole grey November expanse of it, the sky and water almost the same color at the horizon. Quell was at a desk near the windows. He stood when she came in, which she hadn't expected, and gestured to the chair across from him. And she sat, and he sat, and there was a tray of coffee that she hadn't asked for, but that she was grateful for. "I want to offer you a position," he said. "Officially, it would be described as a private accounts manager for a group of affiliated companies. What it would actually be is keeping the books for my operations. All of them. Vivienne held her coffee cup and looked at him. "That's a large ask," she said carefully. "It is. You don't know me. I know you noticed something last night, that 6 people in that building were paid specifically to prevent anyone from noticing," he said. "And I know you walked over to a table. You had every reason to walk past, and you put a piece of paper under my hand with 5 words on it." A pause. "I'm interested in how you think." She thought about the spreadsheets, about the 6 years of careful work in rooms where she was not expected to see much, about the discrepancy in the Carrington accounts. 4 months, $600, recurring. She thought about whether she'd known, on some level, that something about that club had been wrong for longer than last night. "The Carrington Club has a discrepancy in its private dining receipts," she said. 4 months, $600 per quarter, disguised in the discretionary column. "That wasn't in the audit I filed this morning." He was very still. "I can tell you where it goes," she said. "I followed it back yesterday, before I delivered the invoices. It goes to an external vendor account that doesn't appear anywhere else in the books. The account was opened 18 months ago." She watched him understand what she was telling him. Not just what the discrepancy meant, but what it meant that she had found it and had held it. "You didn't put it in the audit," he said. "No. Why not?" She looked at him directly. "Because I didn't know yet who it belonged to. I don't file what I don't understand." The silence between them was the productive kind. "Vivienne," he said. It was the first time he'd used her name. He said it like he'd already considered it. "I need someone who sees what's there, not what they're supposed to see, and who knows when to be quiet about it." "What would I be walking into?" she said. It wasn't entirely a question. Honestly, more than you want to know at first. Less than you'd think if you've been working adjacent to it for 6 years already. She thought about the careful life, the small apartment, the sensible shoes, the pinned-back hair, the practiced invisibility. She thought about the woman she had been every day for 3 years in that club, moving through rooms she was never meant to really occupy, seeing things no one thought she was seeing. She thought about the moment she had written those 5 words, and how her hands had been steady, and what that meant. "All right," she said. She said it the same way she'd said it the night before, and she wondered if he noticed. He did. The winter came in hard that year, the way Toronto winters arrive, not gradually but all at once. The temperature dropping a dozen degrees in a single afternoon, the streets going from autumn grey to something colder and more permanent. Vivienne moved through it with the same quality of stillness she brought to everything, the same watchful quiet. She had always been good at making herself part of the room. Now she made herself part of his world, and it was a stranger and more complicated room than any she'd been in before. She was good at the work she'd known she would be. The accounts were multi-layered, intentionally obscure, designed to be opaque to anyone who hadn't been inside them for months. She was inside them within 3 weeks. She found 2 irregularities in the first month that no one had noticed, not errors, the deliberate kind. The kind that look like formatting until you follow them to the end. She told Quell. She told him clearly and without dramatizing it, the same way she'd told him what she'd seen in the Carrington corridor. He listened with the same quality of complete attention. "How long has this been running?" he asked. "One of them, 14 months. The other a little longer. Who?" She placed the printout on the desk in front of him. He looked at it for a moment. "You're certain," he said. "I don't come to you with things I'm not certain of," she said. He looked up at her. Something in his expression was very quiet. "No," he said. "You don't." She learned him the way she learned ledgers, by looking at what was there rather than what was labeled. He was not easy to understand, and she didn't pretend otherwise. He was a man who had built an empire on the premise that most people were either loyal or useful or afraid, and that the first category was the most reliable and the rarest. He trusted almost nothing, and the things he trusted he protected with a thoroughness that would have looked like obsession in a lesser man. He started protecting her before she noticed he was doing it. The car that appeared when she worked late, the detail she clocked eventually, the way you clock a recurring figure in a column, the same two-man rotation, close enough to be coverage, far enough to be deniable. She didn't mention it at first. Then one evening in late February, leaving the waterfront office with her coat buttoned against a wind coming off the lake that cut through everything, she paused on the pavement and looked at the car idling on the opposite side of the street. She looked at it for a long moment, then she walked across and knocked on the window. The man inside, young, unhappy to be caught, trying to decide on an expression, looked at her. "You can park closer," she said. "I know you're there. It's cold." She went home. The next day she didn't mention it to Quell, and he didn't mention it to her, but the car was closer after that. Spring arrived by degrees. She attended for the first time a private dinner at the waterfront building. Not as staff, not as a peripheral presence, but at the table. She wore a dark blue dress she'd bought, because it was the color of the lake on a clear day, and she'd looked at herself in the mirror for a moment before she left her apartment and had not made herself look away. She'd pinned her hair back out of habit, and then, after a moment, taken the pins out. She arrived to find 8 people at the table who were, in their various ways, the people who ran things in this city, from the places that didn't appear in the newspapers. She sat at Quell's right, and she did not disappear. She asked questions when she had questions, and she said nothing when she had nothing to say. And at the end of the evening, the man on her left, a Port Authority contact with careful eyes and 30 years of practice at reading rooms, had said to her, quietly, as people were leaving, "You're the one who figured out the Carrington accounts." It wasn't quite a question. "I reconcile numbers," she said. He nodded, slowly, in a way that suggested he understood exactly what that meant in the context they were both currently occupying. She had been invisible for so long that becoming visible felt, at first, like standing too close to a window, exposing in a way she didn't entirely trust. But there was a difference between being seen by people who were looking through you and being seen by someone who was actually looking. She'd spent 6 years mastering the first. The second was new. Quell was not a man who said things he didn't mean. He also was not a man who said things he meant in particularly direct language. She learned this too, the way she learned everything about him, sideways by accumulation, by noticing what was consistent, what was consistent. He listened to her with his full attention. He used her name. When she spoke in a room full of people whose opinion outweighed hers by every measurable social metric, his posture aligned toward her, slightly, involuntarily, the way a person's attention aligns toward the thing they're most focused on. She noticed it the 4th time before she let herself think about what it meant. It was early April when she found the last piece of it, the thing that completed the picture of what had been happening inside his organization for the past 2 years. She'd been following a thread for 6 weeks, the kind of thread you follow quietly, because pulling it too hard collapses something structural. She followed it to its end. She sat with the completed picture for the better part of an afternoon, the lake visible through the office window, its surface breaking into small whitecaps in the wind. Then she called Quell. "I need to show you something," she said. "Tonight, if you can." He came to the office within the hour. She laid it out for him, every piece in sequence as clearly as she could make it. She showed him where it began and where it had gone and who specifically had been moving it. The name at the end of the thread was not a name he had expected. She could see that in the stillness that came over him, different from his usual stillness, this one with an edge underneath it. "You're certain," he said again. "I documented every step," she said. "You can trace it yourself." He did, right then, sitting across from her at the desk. Methodical, unhurried, pulling up files and cross-referencing them with the notes she'd placed in front of him. She watched him work, and thought that this was what it looked like from the outside when she did it. This same quality of total absorption, the world contracting to the problem in front of you. When he finished, he closed the laptop and looked at her. "You could have sent this to me in an email," he said. "I know." "Why didn't you?" She considered her answer. "Because I didn't want to know how you'd feel about it from the tone of a reply." He looked at her for a long moment. "I've had 3 people in 20 years who I trusted to tell me things I needed to hear," he said. "Not what I wanted, not what was convenient, what was actually there." She said nothing. She'd learned when to wait. "2 of them are still with me," he said. "Now there are 3. She looked at the lake, grey and open through the window. She thought about the anteroom in the Carrington Club, the cold tea, the 3-inch gap in the door, the 45 seconds she had sat in her chair, and thought about whether there was any version of this where she didn't get up. She thought about who she had been before that night, and who she had been waking up every morning since. Not dramatically different in any visible way. Still quiet, still watchful, still precise, but different in the way a person is different when they stop making themselves smaller as a default. "All right," she said, for the 3rd time. He caught it this time. She could see that he caught it, the repetition, the particular shape of it. "You keep saying that," he said. "It keeps being the right answer," she said. He almost smiled. She was learning the vocabulary of that. The places where something almost happened on his face, and what those almost happenings meant. This one meant something she would think about later, in her apartment with its coffee smell and its quiet, by which point she would understand it well enough to name it. But that was later. Right now, the lake was going gold at its far edge, where the sun was dropping, and the city outside the window was doing what it always did, moving, indifferent, enormous, full of rooms where people were making decisions that would never appear in any clean column of numbers. She was part of that now, this careful woman with her steady hands and her eye for what didn't reconcile, this woman who had taught herself to disappear and had one night, almost without thinking, decided to be seen instead. She gathered her papers. She tucked them into her bag. She stood. "Same time tomorrow," she said. "Same time tomorrow," said Donovan Quell, and she walked out into the April evening, into the good cold smell of the lake and the last of the city's winter, and her heels were steady on the pavement and her hair was down.